Hey guys, Ryan Sprague here, and I want to tell you all about an exciting event that I'm going to be speaking at in Hexham, England on August 9th. It's called Cosmic Frequencies. Cosmic Frequencies is going to be an unforgettable evening of mind-expanding science, live cosmic funk music, and of course, UFOs. The event is bringing together leading voices from the frontiers of space exploration, UFO research, and science communication. Curated by the SKX Funkanauts Band in collaboration with Kielder Observatory, this immersive event features powerful live music interwoven with talks from astrophysicist and SETI researcher Dr. Beatrice Villarreal, representative of the Kielder Observatory, Dan Pye, Emmy-nominated filmmaker and former executive producer for the BBC, Steve Crabtree, and yours truly, talking all about the human side of UFO experiences, with stunning celestial visuals and a special panel discussion and Q&A. This evening celebrates the intersection of art, science, and curiosity, and a journey through space, sound, and the unknown. There will also be a special VIP meet and greet after the talks. Cosmic Frequencies is being held at the Forum Cinema in Hexham, England. Join us on August 9th. For more information and to purchase your tickets, visit cosmicfrequencies.org. Once again, that's cosmicfrequencies.org. And let's get funky!
While our government's official position is not to speculate on this subject, we can choose to let our minds explore other possibilities, to use our imaginations. For if we consider that scientists agree on one point, that the possibility of life elsewhere is not only quite probable, some feel it is there without a doubt. Let us suppose then that these objects are real space vehicles, extraterrestrial in origin, and not an illusion of the mind.
You are now somewhere in the skies.
Today we have one of our fan favorite guests coming back on the show, returning for the umpteenth time to talk about something that I recently just discovered, and I feel like a bad ufologist for that, but we had James Fox on the show talking all about computer scientist and noted astronomer, UFO researcher, Jacques Vallée, and he talked about a little memorandum that he had found while working with another very prominent UFO researcher, and how this memo affected his work moving forward. And I knew nothing about it, and it blew my mind. And of course, the one person I knew I could count on to walk me through this memorandum that we're going to talk about, the implication to it, what it's all about, is none other than Micah Hanks. How you doing, buddy?
Great to be here as always, my man, and glad to hear that you are on the beat as usual.
Absolutely, man. And again, I knew nothing about this, a program supposedly running parallel to Project Blue Book. I mean, a lot of us have theorized for years that this Project Blue Book that the U.S. Air Force had implemented to explain away most of UFO reports that came to them, that was it, and that there was nothing between then and what we now know is the secret Pentagon UFO program, and that, everything had an explanation except for those unknowns that Project Blue Book came up with. But now I'm learning that the story goes much deeper than that. And it all started with the Pentacle Memorandum, which I would love to talk to you about. But before we get to that, let's talk about the two guys who kind of brought this all to the forefront. I mean, a lot of my listeners and viewers know these two names, but for those maybe just hopping in who don't know these people as well as we do, being one of them, tell us a little about the relationship between J. Allen Hynek and Jacques Vallée and how this all came to be, I guess. Would you mind giving us a little history lesson of the origin story of these two? Good cop, bad cop, buddy cop, yeah.
I would be delighted. Valet, of course, was one of the first scientists to publish a popular book, but from a scientific perspective, looking at the UFO enigma. That, of course, Anatomy of a Phenomenon. Now, he, although at the time was also working with J. Allen Hynek, Hynek was one of the most visible UFO researchers, you might say, at the time, but really what he was a science advisor. As a professor of astronomy at Northwestern University, he was a science advisor to the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book. Now, again, a little bit more about Valet here. He had already been interested in UFOs when he was in France, and he comes to the United States with his wife, Janine, and they move here. And in pretty short order, Valet ends up working under Heinik there at the university. And, of course, this makes him privy from a scientific perspective to much of the Blue Book work that was going on, including, of course, their witness reports involving purported UFO sightings. And, again, they had a good working relationship, but if one wants a really interesting perspective on all of this, I mean, what you might call essential reading, of course, read the Heinik UFO report. This was a book that was written after Heinik, of course, had left his position working as an advisor to the U.S. Air Force. But during those U.S. Air Force years, when he was an official advisor to Blue Book, he had to kind of walk a certain line, you might say. Heinik couldn't go all in and say, guys, there's obviously a phenomenon here. And in fact, he often kind of pivoted and was more skeptical. In fact, there were certain instances where he was skeptical enough that he was kind of held accountable by the UFO community and would never fully live down some of the statements that he'd made. The most famous one, of course, the UFO sightings over Michigan, which he had said were probably swamp gas. Now, Heinik later defended his position and said, I was kind of under pressure. I had to come up with a theory. Of course, I wanted to always be skeptically inclined and never seem like I'm all in. We're being visited. The invasion's underway. But for years, many commentators, including Jerome Clark and others, had noted that, that was kind of something that would haunt Heinik for many years. And his positions also would soften with time, and he would even acknowledge, saying what I had said at that time is not necessarily in line with my thoughts, having seen Project Blue Book from close to its outset through to the end, and of course the University of Colorado UFO Project headed by Edward U. Condon, seeing all of that. Heinik's hope during those years having been that, the outcome of the Condon Committee might be that he, Valet, and other scientists working with them would be able to have a renewed, strengthened scientific effort and perhaps funding for it from the U.S. Air Force or scientific organizations to look more deeply at the UFO phenomenon. As we know, that didn't end up being the outcome. So, as far as Heinik and his involvement at the time, he was having to really kind of walk the tightrope. He was both an advocate at times if he saw that there was a case to be made for a legitimate UFO sighting, but he also knew what the Air Force wanted to hear, and he himself was skeptical from the outset and became less so with time. Now, Valet, on the other hand, he comes into this having had an interest in UFOs while in France, bringing that with him, actually having seen a couple of unidentified objects of the aerial variety himself, bringing that with him to the United States. And he wanted, above all else, Dr. Valet, and this is an entirely respectable position, especially for someone who, throughout the middle 1960s, seeing the developments in UFOs, seeing the speculation about what the Air Force was studying and what the nature of this phenomenon might be, its provenance, where does it come from, Valet said, we need scientists looking at this. And so he, at times, was very frustrated with Heinik. And he would write, and this also on the necessary reading list, if you read the Heinik UFO report, don't forget also to read the 4-volume set that Valet wrote, Forbidden Science. Especially in that first volume of Forbidden Science, Valet, he begins as a college student, and it carries you through those pivotal years of Project Blue Book. And in his journal, he is writing and saying he is frustrated with Allen. He wishes that Heinik, instead of going on the lecture circuit, would be back at the university laboratory, and we could be processing these UFO sightings. We could be analyzing these reports. This is the most important thing we could be doing right now. Mm-hmm. Well, so he is frustrated to a point. Oh, I'm sorry. Jump in there.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that was one of the more fascinating things that I didn't personally know until I heard you speak about what we're going to be talking about, this relationship between the two. Now, we see these archival images of the two, and they look like the two coolest guys out there. they're best friends. They're out there hunting UFOs and tracking down leads. But in reality, it seemed that Heinik was kind of on a different path, and he was really kind of craving that notoriety and that acknowledgement by the public. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but as time went on, he became like a spokesperson for the Air Force on this, and he liked the limelight. Let's be completely honest. He was he was not the most modest person when it came to don't put me on television, just the facts. Like he kind of liked this, right, Micah? He kind of liked the attention.
If you go on YouTube, there is a dating game show, okay, where Heinik is a guest on this game show. So, yes, he certainly did not shy away from the camera, but he was also a person who was attempting to be more fair and balanced toward the UFO issue maybe than most. Again, if you look at his contemporaries who, like Donald Kehoe, I mean, they were all in. They had really championed the extraterrestrial hypothesis. Kehoe had authored a number of articles in popular magazines like Look and True magazine, which, at times maybe went a little further than just advocacy. I mean, they went really right up to the brink and sometimes beyond into sensational territory. Heinik, for the skepticism that people criticized him for in years later, when he finishes his advisory position with Blue Book and everything, and then he kind of goes out there and finally says, okay, on further review, there is a case to be made for the existence of the phenomenon, whatever it is. For those who would criticize his skepticism, I think he was trying to find a balance between the overt skepticism of Donald Menzel and others, again, the Harvard astronomer, one of the first, really, even before Valet, to write a scientific book about UFOs. But again, Menzel's takes an extremely skeptical approach. And in his journals, Valet, as he is preparing for the publication of Anatomy of a Phenomenon, which we might say is the first popular book that is written by a scientist from a scientist's perspective, but which is in advocacy of the existence of the phenomenon and in the furtherance of the case for studying it. That was Valet's whole point. He wanted to kind of be I guess, the antithesis of, but still a scientific perspective, counter to what Menzel was doing. So anyway, Menzel was the arch skeptic of his day. And then you had the Kehoes on the other side. Heinik was trying to find that balance. So I found it to be a respectable position, and therefore his desire to be, in the limelight, so to speak, I mean, it had its benefits. He was probably the most balanced commentator of that era who could be out there speaking to audiences. And so he was getting a lot of attention, getting a lot of requests for presentations and things. And he didn't turn them down, but this frustrated Valet because Jacques, of course, is sitting back at the university and he's saying, here is where the work is done. And it's great to get out there and evangelize and tell the public about how science can benefit from the study of UAP. But, if we really want to understand what this phenomenon may be, whether there's a threat potential, whether this is something that science can actually examine and maybe explain, we've got to do that work in the lab first. And that included, of course, a careful review and a better organizational system applied to the file system related to Project Blue Book and, of course, its predecessors, Grudge and Sign. Now, that's really where this story begins. In 1967, Valet decides he's going to help his friend, J. Allen Hynek. He says, I'm going to go over there. I'm going to go to his office at his house. I'm going to get a bunch of these files that are in such disarray. I'm going to take these things back over there, and I'm going to try and, at the observatory, I'm going to try and, classify. I'm going to try and straighten these files up and get them ordered. And so he's going through the files, and he's trying to do this. He's lamenting in what poor shape so many of the files are in.
Right.
And he decides, I'm just going to try and go through these. And so he says the worst section of the files, and I'm actually going to quote Valet here from my notes. A passage from his journal, which was published in that first edition of the Forbidden Science series. He said the worst section of the files concern the history of the Air Force projects themselves from Sign and Grudge to Blue Book. And so he is going through these documents. And again, a little bit of history here also. In 1952, following a recommendation to the Intelligence Advisory Committee following the Central Intelligence Agency's own review of Project Blue Book, there had been a panel famously convened in 1953. This was headed by Howard P. Robertson and Hence, it was aptly named, or it is best known as the Robertson Panel. And its conclusion is, of course, or was, that UFOs did not present a significant threat, we'll say, to national security. But the Robertson Panel did express some concerns about other things related to UFOs, namely that widespread public interest in the phenomenon might also represent a potential threat. And in a couple of ways. We don't want people getting carried away or getting frightened. We also don't want public interest to be something that might potentially be exploitable, maybe even by a foreign adversary, which would therefore allow for clogging of communication channels and things along these lines. Now, that occurred in 1953. The following year, there was a study that was also completed by the Battelle Memorial Institute, based on a statistical analysis that involved about 3,200 Blue Book reports that had been collected by that time. And then that was later published by the U.S. Air Force, made available, I think, the following year after that. So it might have been maybe 1955 or 6 when that was published. But this was the famous Project Blue Book Special Report number 14, which you often heard Stanton Friedman and others talk about. So anyway, that's sort of the lineage of what was going on at that time in the 1950s. Fast forward again to 1967, there's Valet working through his friend Alan Hynek's files. He says Alan had misplaced many of the documents. And it is in that section, talking about these boxes of files from that era, that I found a letter that is especially remarkable, Valet wrote, because of the new light it throws on the key period of the Robertson Panel and of the classic report number 14. Now, as Valet describes it in Forbidden Science, he says it is stamped in red ink, secret security information. It is dated 9th of January, 1953. It is signed by a man I will call Pentacle. And this document disturbed Valet because as he is reading this memorandum, it's essentially a communication with an individual whose name later was released. We'll talk about that later because it's publicly known now. He calls him Pentacle, but it seems to be describing a case to be made for some kind of a secret UFO operation where, first of all, thousands of reports are being examined and being studied for various reasons, and in relation to various areas where UFOs are being seen. And one of the ideas that is proposed in the memorandum is that in these areas where people see a lot of UFOs, we should, institute monitoring systems, and we should also plan for a number of secret Air Force operations and military operations where we have aircraft flying in that area. Essentially, it seems to be describing we should attempt to try and carry out secret exercises in the sky that would mislead the public to think that there is UFO phenomenon going on in those areas. That disturbed Valet. That was what concerned him about this memorandum. And he, of course, talks about it to J. Allen Hynek, and then it's kind of forgotten about for a number of years. It comes to light again in the early 1990s when he publishes Valet, Forbidden Science, and then this kind of opened an entire can of worms for the UFO community because many people thought, well, maybe we can use the Freedom of Information Act or, some other means to get a copy of this document, find out what it actually said, and lo and behold, a few years later, it actually did eventually surface.
Right. And then, once it did surface and we kind of learned who this person was that wrote it, that's where things got really interesting for me, Micah, when we started to learn names of who Pentacle could be and why this letter was being sent to Wright-Patterson, which a lot of our listeners and viewers know is possibly the place where the Roswell wreckage was stored. I see the headline right behind you there in down in the bunker. Love it. So let's talk a little maybe about, if you wouldn't mind, the person who wrote this H.C. Cross, as we've come to learn. Do you know much about this individual, who he was, who he worked for? Yeah, what can you share with us about all of that?
There isn't all that much known about Howard Cross, but again, his name is known. Now, the memorandum eventually surfaced. I actually would like to read from the memorandum because we're going to find, and I want to go ahead and state this early on, even though I hope to somewhat vindicate some of Valet's perspectives, I do think that there is a strong case to be made that on further historical review, we can certainly explain a lot about the Pentacle Memorandum, and I don't fundamentally agree with all of Valet's conclusions about it. But I also think that we have to understand the historical context into which he interpreted it the way that he did, and the reasons that, that kind of led to that. Because there was a lot going on at that time, chief among them, the fact that he and Heinik at the time had felt that they weren't being made privy to all of the Blue Book reports. They had long felt that there was a military element that they were not fully able to access with relation to the actual reporting of UFOs. And I think that, in fact, that aspect of this can actually be shown, that can be proven. But coming back around to this memorandum and who actually wrote this, we'll start with the memo, and then we'll talk about how it came to light. The document can be read online. There is a website called CUFON, not to be confused with MUFON, and that is the Computer UFO Network website. They have a copy of it archived in text form, and they note a bit of brief background that they provide here, actually from 1993. They say the Pentacle Memorandum has been a controversial item since its existence was revealed to the wider UFO community by Dr. Jacques Vallée in his excellent work, Forbidden Science, which, of course, we have referenced a few times here, and I believe it would have been published a year prior to this being posted on their site. They said Valet found the two-page memo in 1967, as we know, while going through Allen's papers. Shortly thereafter, the document, which purported to be the Pentacle Memo, came into limited circulation among certain researchers. Chief among them was Barry Greenwood, who is truly an icon in this field, and he, along with Lawrence Fawcett, co-authored a fantastic book. Really, yet again, I'm going to keep making must-read additions to the UFO History Chronicle throughout the evening here. And that book, Clear Intent, is the original title it was published under, but it was later republished under the UFO cover-up. But if you read Barry Greenwood and Larry Fawcett's work, you'll see why I recommend it so highly. In fact, I mean, it was the blueprint by which many modern researchers, I think, have built, the crux of their UFO inquiries toward government through the Freedom of Information Act. So, as they note here at their site, among other things, this document, which Valet called Pentacle, contains confirmation that Battelle Memorial Institute was working on UFO projects at the time of the Robertson panel. Now, at this point, I want to skip ahead to the actual document and read to you, and then maybe give you some further clarification and context for what we're reading about. But the listeners at home should try to put yourself in Valet's shoes. Imagine it's 1967. There's a lot about the UFO phenomenon and the government's involvement with it that was not known at that time. And Valet, along with Heinik, were people who should have known more than the average person would about this phenomenon at that time. And, of course, had direct access to government information about it. So it would have certainly surprised Valet to read the following. And I quote here, addressed to Mr. Miles E. Gold, gives his address. It says, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Ohio. And attention, Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, who, of course, this document dated January 9th, 1953. At the time, he was I believe by that time, he would have been the head of Project Blue Book. Ruppelt is addressed, and it says, Dear Mr. Gold, this letter, we're reading from the actual memorandum. This letter concerns a preliminary recommendation to ATIC on future methods of handling the problem of unidentified aerial objects. This recommendation is based on our experience to date in analyzing several thousands of reports on this subject. We regard the recommendation as preliminary because our analysis is not yet complete, and we are not able to document it where we feel it should be supported by facts from the analysis. So they make the following recommendation. They say, we are making this recommendation prematurely because the CIA-sponsored meeting of a scientific panel meeting in Washington, D.C., and then they give the dates, to consider the problem of flying saucers. The CIA-sponsored meeting is being held subsequent to a meeting of CIA, ATIC, and our representatives held at ATIC on December 12, 1952. At the December 12th meeting, our representatives strongly recommended that a scientific panel not be set up until the results of our analysis of the sighting reports collected by ATIC were available. And then they go on to also talk about a Project Stork, and they say that between Project Stork and the ATIC, this should be reached as to what can and what cannot be discussed at the meeting in Washington in January concerning our preliminary recommendation to ATIC. Now, again, going only that far, Valet is reading this document and saying, okay, hold on. So this is obviously referring to the panel in Washington and the CIA-sponsored meeting. This is, of course, the Robertson panel, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And here's somebody, Pentacle as he calls him, but we now know that this was a Mr. Howard Cross, and he appears to be saying, I'm advising you guys not to have this meeting until we have completed our review. And further, he actually says that there are thousands of reports that are being analyzed in this review process. Now, this disturbed Valet because he said, first of all, we were unaware at that time that there were thousands of, reports under Blue Book being analyzed, that many even existed to be analyzed.
Right.
And who is this Mr. Cross, and who was, conducting this analysis? And further, did they have, obviously they didn't because the Robertson panel convened anyway, but, why were they saying that a CIA-sponsored panel shouldn't convene? Well, what is plainly evident now, and what we know in hindsight, is that Cross was with the Battelle Institute. Although they did not publish the findings until the year after the Robertson panel convened, as we mentioned earlier, Cross was with the Battelle Institute. He was referring to the Battelle Memorial Institute review, which, of course, after it was completed, and then that was, again, supplied to the U.S. Air Force, it was subsequently published as the Project Blue Book Special Report number 14. He is saying, we haven't completed the study that would eventually become that report. That scientific information would be of extreme use to the Robertson panel. We advise you guys cool your jets and hold off until we finish this study. But they didn't. But what's really interesting is that apparently Valet had not been aware of the fact that they were conducting this study for the U.S. Air Force. At least that much could be gleaned from the fact that he was very surprised to hear that Cross, i.e. Pentacle, was saying, we've got thousands of reports we're looking through. I mean, again, more than like 3,200, I think, if memory serves. And so he's saying, yeah, give us some time. We've got to try and dig through all of this. But now returning to the memo, what disturbed Valet, the first portion here was nonetheless surprising, but I mean, he really gets disturbed when he reads further, and it says the following. Experience to date on our study, Battelle, of unidentified flying objects shows that there is a distinct lack of reliable data with which to work. Even the best documented reports are frequently lacking in critical information that makes it impossible to arrive at a possible identification, i.e., even in a well-documented report, there is always an element of doubt about the data, either because the observer had no means of getting the required data or it was not prepared to utilize that individual, the observer, was not prepared to utilize the means at his disposal. And so they say, therefore, we recommend a controlled experiment be set up by which reliable physical data can be obtained. They say a tentative preliminary plan by which the experiment could be designated, or rather designed and carried out, is discussed in the following paragraphs. So they go on to talk about the ways that they would hope to try and carry out a wide-reaching experiment that would help us gain more information about UFOs than the general public had managed to do. In other words, they're saying, we realize the average observer doesn't have access to all of the kind of instruments that might be helpful in studying UFOs, that namely because they aren't prepared. They don't know when a UFO sighting is going to occur or where one will be seen. So they said, if based on the review of all this data, we could determine a few things. One, where UFOs are most likely to be seen. Okay. And then two, if we could, based on where we think we're likely to see them, we could set up tracking and monitoring stations so we would be prepared in the event that one actually does show up. We might actually be able to get better information about this phenomenon than the public has as yet produced. Now, they go on to talk about a number of things. They say a very complete record of the weather should also be kept during the time of this experiment. Cross says that coverage should be so complete that any object in the air could be tracked, and information as to its altitude, velocity, size, shape, color, time of day, etc. could be recorded. He says all balloon releases or known balloon paths, aircraft flights, and flights of rockets in the test area should be known to those in charge of the experiment, and notably, he says many different types of aerial activity should be secretly and purposefully scheduled within the area. Now, that specifically is the line that really troubled Valet. He said, okay, what are we talking about here? Now, I could give you my interpretation if you'd like.
Well, let's unpack this, Micah, because this is probably the most sensational aspect to this entire memo, and I can understand why Valet would be troubled by that. We're talking about simulated UFO events, which is seems like a very out there thing, but we have people in modern day theorizing that these things are going on. So you do have to wonder, but I would love to get your interpretation of this, because while it may seem like we're talking a planned UFO event, there's a lot to this. And I think a lot to unpack when it comes to this memo. It's not that big, but it says so much. So it's easy to kind of read between the lines. But yeah, what do you think? What do you think about this?
Well, again, we have to remember that the memo was written in January 1953. Valet is reading it in 1967. And so he presumably is asking himself as he's reading this, okay, well, then in the years leading up to now, these UFOs that I've been studying, how many of these might have been, again, different types of aerial activity that have been secretly and purposefully scheduled within UFO sightings hotspots? I mean, it would have been a fair question for him to ask, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I think for Valet, he was saying, well, the UFO phenomenon we have been studying may not be necessarily what we thought it was. And again, his interpretation at the time, and that's key, his interpretation at the time had been, well, it also seems that there is another group studying UFOs that we don't know about. Now, again, I emphasize the fact that had been his interpretation at the time, because that was based on the evidence at his, disposal. But in hindsight, with our knowledge of the government studies that have looked at UFOs, we know, of course, about SIGN, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book. But, of course, there was also the Battelle study, which we're talking about here. And at the same time, roughly coinciding with and in the midst of, we have the Robertson panel. And then, of course, that all rounds out in 1968 with the University of Colorado project. It concluded that year. It actually ran for a couple of years. But with the conclusion of that project and its findings, we also saw the end of Project Blue Book. And this was a tremendous cultural shift in attitude toward the UFO subject. We saw this shift in media coverage. Throughout the 60s, leading up to the end of that project with the University of Colorado, I mean, you saw a lot of reporting about UFOs, especially in papers of record like the New York Times. And after 1968, that coverage drops off. And it, remains low, even though you see spikes like during the 1990s when the U.S. Air Force reopened the books on Roswell during the Clinton administration. You see periods where there are renewed interest, but never peaks again until really 2017 with the publication of the article, The Shot Heard Around the World, Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper talking about, black budgets and, weird auras and things like this. It had been since the 1960s, prior to the end of the Colorado project, that UFOs were getting that kind of attention. And so we have to recognize that in this period, a tremendous cultural shift was about to occur. And Valet, again, being, he thought, privy to all the Blue Book reports, but apparently had not been, he was very confused at the time about what this memorandum meant, having not been aware, apparently, that it was a member of the Battelle Memorial Institute trying to advise that the CIA hold off until they could finish their study. But I mentioned earlier that we really needed to kind of try and put this into further historical context. And so in addition to all those elements I'm discussing right there, we also have to remember that, and if you read Forbidden Science, you'll actually see Valet comment about this a lot. Apparently, he and Heinik spoke a good bit about the fact that they were frustrated that they felt that there was information being gathered about the phenomenon that they were not made privy to. And so, again, Valet felt, upon finding this memorandum, that this somewhat vindicated his view that, well, maybe the military is gathering more data than what, Alan and I are being made aware of. Now, it wouldn't come to light for a number of years, and this is unrelated to the Pentacle Memorandum, but if we think about the JANAP directive, Stanton Friedman talked a lot about this, and others have too. John Greenwald also has talked about this a lot over the years. The JANAP, I believe JANAP 146 directive, it's essentially describing the communication channels for reporting sightings of unidentified flying objects and other things. A number of things are discussed, but UFOs being one of them. And it's essentially saying what to do if you are a military service man or woman who sees something, how you report it, where it goes. And to give you the very briefest summary, essentially it says that, we contact local military outlets, but we also forward these reports of unidentifieds on to NORAD. And as we know, NORAD is exempt from FOIA. And so as Stanton Friedman and others have argued over the years, what this showed was, in addition to the fact that there were certain reports that were being sent to an agency which was not subject to FOIA once FOIA came into existence, This also shows that there appeared to be a reporting channel outside of and distinct from Project Blue Book. So not all the sightings of UFOs that were occurring, especially those made by the military, were being sent to the Air Force and studied within the context of Project Blue Book. Obviously, there was a separate reporting channel, and there were some reports that went elsewhere. What happens to all those? Those reports, by the way, have a designation there called CIRVIS or CIRVIS. You can actually read some of them online because, yet again, my colleague John Greenwald did manage to obtain a few of those a few years ago, but he didn't get them from the U.S. side of NORAD. He went to the Canadians. He called the Canadian branch. He asked for documents, and they were happy to give him some, but the United States, they will very seldom ever even acknowledge a request for those CIRVIS reports. So, again, we might say that Valet was not wrong, that there was a separate reporting channel, and that's not what the Pentacle Memorandum dealt with. But again, his interpretation of the Pentacle Memorandum had been his suspicion that such a separate reporting channel might exist. And I think he was fundamentally correct on that point.
I would have to agree. I mean, it's clear. I mean, especially when you're dealing with something like JNAP, like you mentioned. The government is very good at finding ways to funnel things into a certain place where the public will never figure it out. And I think this is a prime example of that. And what we can deduce is that Valet was definitely right. There were clearly reports that were not making it to Heinik during Blue Book. We know Blue Book was kind of an exercise in public relations and getting the most filtered version out to the public as possible. But one of the interesting things that I read in an article that you wrote on the Pentacle entire affair is when Valet finally approached Heinik about this memo. And Heinik then went to, I believe it was Battelle, and said, "What is this? What is going on? Would you mind maybe kind of running us through that whole aspect of all this?" Because their reaction was not exactly what you'd expect.
Well, you'd have thought that they would say, "Oh, yeah, that's just our stuff." No, I mean, really, they were not happy that Heinik approached them about it. And they essentially, if memory serves, they kind of tell Heinik, you're not supposed to ever talk about that. And they just kind of shut him down. Now, what I'll point out is, and this is something that is pretty well known, I guess, in certain UFO circles, but I mentioned Hynek's book, the Heinik UFO Report, earlier. Early in that book, I believe the first chapter, around page 21 or 22, it's one of those or somewhere in there, he mentions a document from Battelle Memorial Institute that was sent to members of the Robertson panel. There's only about a paragraph about it, and then there are some additional paragraphs thereafter that discuss sort of the context. But Heinik, back in the 70s when he published that book, he was referring to the Pentacle Memorandum. Now, obviously, he knew about it because it was in his files. Valet found it, and Valet goes to Heinik, and he addresses the issue with Heinik. And then, like you mentioned, yes, Heinik went to Battelle, and he asks questions about this later. And so their response seemed to further vindicate Valet's view that we are being told not to talk about something that we found, and this clearly shows that there's UFO study going on outside of what we are being made privy to. And we were supposed to be the scientific advisors to Blue Book. But I think it's interesting to point out that even though Valet would write about the Pentacle Memorandum, and he had essentially been the first person to really reference it in detail back in 1992, I mean, a number of years beforehand, Heinik did mention it in his book. He didn't refer to it as Pentacle. He didn't name the author, but he references the document right there early in his book, and it's a clear reference. And I actually went back and checked on that. And again, I want to give a shout out to Isaac Coy online. He is a fantastic researcher, and he has an entire list at his website of references in various literature from over the years that are made to that document. He actually includes Hynek's reference to it on his list, so good on him. He is a fantastic researcher, one of the best in my opinion. But yeah, there it is. I mean, Heinik has talked about this, even prior to Valet. Now, what does that mean? Well, I mean, it's not like he beat Valet to the punch. Of course, he knew about it. Valet had talked about it with him. He had found it in Allen's files. But the legacy of Pentacle, I think, is a bit of a mixed bag, because although I think that Valet was somewhat vindicated on his broader perception of what was happening at that time, I also disagree with his interpretation of that document, because now with further historical insight about what was happening at that time, we know, of course, that Howard Cross was with Battelle. They were conducting a study. Blue Book had gathered more than 3,000 UFO reports at that time. Those were being studied, and that would be later published in the special report number 14, they were explicitly saying to the Robertson panel, look, guys, hold off until we finish this study. You really will need the information that we could provide. So that's what they're saying. But now there's a bit of controversy, too. And I know you've got some questions from listeners we'll get to here in a moment, but I'll just add, there's been quite a bit of controversy about this document over the years because, again, Valet has maintained that even though we can agree on the historical circumstances at play here, he says that in the coming years, this was his feeling, and I think that this was really kind of springboarding off of that controversial line about, controlled experiments and things. Valet seemed to be of the mind that the full implications of the Pentacle Memorandum would only be revealed with time. There were others who kind of thought that this was a fairly mundane document, and of course, one we've already mentioned had been Barry Greenwood, and I want to share a bit of a correspondence that the Computer UFO Network website actually features online where, and again, you talk about like just dialogue between titans in the field. Here's Barry Greenwood and Valet going back and forth about this memorandum. I'll first quote here briefly from Valet writing to another colleague, and he mentions that the question of the origin of the document may be unimportant. He says, perhaps the people who released it will go public eventually. He says the best course of action, however, would be to seek access to the original document and to others of the same vintage. And then he forwards along to his colleague Dale the following statements from Barry Greenwood. Barry, again, gives us a lot of context for things like the Project Twinkle that are mentioned in this document. And he says specifically at the outset of his memo to Valet, Barry Greenwood here, it makes no reference, this document, to any recovered UFO hardware at Roswell or elsewhere or to alien bodies. He says the greater significance of what it does say. No, I'm sorry. Let me back up. This isn't Barry Greenwood. This is Valet writing to Barry Greenwood in their correspondence. Let's start there. So he is saying to Barry Greenwood, the greater significance of what this document does say will slowly emerge in the coming years as the overall implications come to light. So Valet points out to Greenwood a few things. He says Project Twinkle and other observational efforts by the military, which you mentioned in an effort to show that Pentacle was only dusting off an old idea, were purely passive projects. In sharp contrast, the Pentacle proposal goes far beyond anything mentioned before and daringly states that many different types of aerial activity should be, and he underlines this, Valet does, secretly and purposefully scheduled within the area. Now, Valet, again commenting on this, says it is difficult to be more clear. We are not talking simply about setting up observation stations and cameras. We're talking about large-scale covert simulation of UFO waves under military control. So that is explicitly what Valet was concerned with, and in his letter to Barry Greenwood, he says, this is what they seem to be describing. Now, again, offering a bit of a different perspective, my interpretation would have been that the military, if they had, based on the Blue Book data, what they thought were UFO hotspots, places where people thought they were able to see more UFOs and where more sightings appeared to originate from. With little doubt, the military would have wanted to try and put aircraft out there or put objects that they might be able to use to gauge how the public reacts. And that way they could see if people, again, the benefit to me would be that they would see how people respond. Let's say they put up a weather balloon and people go, there's another UFO and we've seen them here before, so we know this one must be a UFO too. It's obviously a flying saucer. Well, the military, if they knew what they had put up in the air and that's how people responded, they might, come away from it going, okay, well, we put a weather balloon up and people acted exactly as they had 10 years ago when they had said they'd saw a bunch of, seen a bunch of UFOs in the same area. So we might glean from this that under those circumstances in that area, people generally describe very prosaic things as being unidentified flying objects. I would see that as being one potential benefit that the military might have derived from carrying out these controlled secret experiments, right? But again, to Valet's point, he's like, yeah, but if it's controlled and it's secret and they are essentially simulating a UFO wave, they are deceiving the public. And he seems to take issue with that. His next point that he makes to Barry Greenwood, and he says this is the greatest implication, which I'll quote him here, is perhaps not obvious on first reading, but which amounts to a scandal of major proportion in the eyes of any scientist, he says, has to do with the outright manipulation of the Robertson panel. He says, here is a special meeting of the 5 most eminent scientists in the land assembled by the government to discuss a matter of national security. Not only are they made, or rather not made aware of all the data, but another group has already decided what can and cannot be discussed. And he again quoting Pentacle, i.e. cross. So Valet says, Dr. Heinik categorically stated to me that the panel was not briefed about the Pentacle proposals. Now, again, unpacking that aspect, Heinik's upset because he sees this as manipulation of the CIA-sponsored Robertson panel. But again, my takeaway, and I think this had been Barry Greenwood's, would be, well, what they were saying was, we advise that you guys postpone because we haven't finished the study. If we finish the study, then you guys can see our results. So you might call that manipulation, but again, it would have been, in my view, to the best interest of the Robertson panel to hold off until the Battelle Memorial Institute completed their study. So I could see it from that perspective. And again, I might disagree with Valet on that point. There's little I disagree with him on, I'll mind you. But again, that's one point I'll take. And so, but again, he also says, nonetheless, though, that Heinik categorically stated to him that the panel was not briefed about the Pentacle proposals. The reason that might be, of course, had been that the Battelle Memorial Institute had not finished their study. So why would Robertson's panel have been briefed until that point? If anything, it seems based on the fact that the memorandum exists, that their desire would have been to be able to brief Robertson, but they didn't have anything to brief him with. They said, we aren't done with our study. Give us some time. If you guys can wait, then we can brief you. So if they weren't briefed, it was probably because Battelle hadn't finished the study yet at that point. So anyway.
Battelle, procrastinators, man, I tell you.
Well, those are the main points again. And you can kind of see why this became such a big deal, because at that time, Barry Greenwood, with the Just Cause newsletter he was doing, he had, again, with Larry Fawcett, published the book at that time called Clear Intent, but the same book you can find now under the title The UFO Cover-Up. He then began to publish another newsletter, Barry Greenwood, called the UFO Historical Review. And you can find all these online. By the way, if you go to the Greenwood Archive, just go online and search for the Barry Greenwood or just Greenwood UFO Archive, and you'll find the website. It's a very simple blog website, but Barry has uploaded as PDFs a lot of these newsletters. So you can go online and you can read all of these. And if you're interested in the history of this subject like I am, and obviously I am the kind of guy who's been reading a lot about the history, but I've been doing it for years. I mean, it's nothing different. But I highly recommend Barry Greenwood's work. He is one of the most diligent researchers. And again, he is a documents guy. Barry is a historically minded researcher who works with documents. Valet is also someone who has worked a lot with documents over the years, having been one of the first scientists who had access, he thought, initially to the majority of the Blue Book documents, and later he found maybe not as many as there actually were in existence. But he's a scientist and a person who tries to apply the scientific method toward a very novel and perplexing topic. And this is really, rather than a right versus wrong, Greenwood was right, no, Valet was, this is more like two different areas converging, trying to find some semblance of truth. And although I think that Barry's interpretation really of the history of the documents is correct, again, Valet's experience as a scientist working with Heinik at that time informed his opinions about it. And he wasn't entirely wrong about some of his takeaways about the nature of government and its attitudes, especially its secrecy.
Absolutely. I think you're right. I think while one looks at it one way, another's going to look at it another way. And we always hear with these documents is read between the lines. So many people say these types of things. So of course they're going to interpret them differently. And I think you're right. I don't think there's a right or a wrong when it comes to this. It's a fascinating historical piece that we have in this entire UFO thing that we will probably debate till the end of time. But I found it super interesting. I'm so happy that you were able to kind of walk us through this, because it's so easy for these things to get overlooked, Micah, that the public would never even know this existed. I didn't know. And the minute I said, whoa, did anyone know that there was a project running parallel to Project Blue Book? And everyone starts commenting on, my social media, like, oh, do you mean Stork or do you mean Pentacle? And I'm like, no, something else. But lo and behold, that's what it was. So I definitely got taken to school on this one. And what I think is,
hold on, that's all right. That's all right. Look, there's this attitude that, oh, you don't know this, you don't know that. Look, we're all in this together to try and educate one another. I get schooled frequently by my friends, and not just in the UFO field. Try hanging out with guys like Tim McMillan, or Jason Pentrail, for a while. I mean, you'll learn really quickly. that, there are limits to what any one individual can know. And I hope also, with all of my colleagues, to be able to fill that gap for them at times too. So there's no shame in not knowing everything. And, anyone who acts like, oh, you didn't know this or that, look, everyone at some point is going to be afforded that opportunity to be told something they had no idea about. So again, no shame right there, man. We're all in this to learn.
That's such a good point, brother. And I think it's important too to look at the history of these things, because then we can start to see how it bleeds into what we're dealing with today. And I do have some listener questions kind of relating to Pentacle and some not so much, but these should be fun. Let's get to these listener questions. Miska on Facebook asks, what criteria do you, Micah, use when trying to decipher a report or a memorandum's veracity, if and when they are revealed?
Greetings, everyone. Ryan Sprague here, host of Somewhere in the Skies. For over 7 years and more than 400 episodes, the Somewhere in the Skies podcast has always been free to listen to, but it's not free to create. So we offer several ways to help support our efforts and get rewards in return. If you listen to the podcast on Apple, you can click the subscribe button at the top of your Somewhere in the Skies feed to become a premium Apple subscriber. Or you can join our Patreon campaign with several tiers available. Both of these options give you the same benefits and rewards: ad-free episodes, early access to the main show, and bonus episodes and content. Help keep the lights on at the Somewhere in the Skies HQ, and help us continue to grow by becoming a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/somewhereskies, or by clicking the subscribe button at the top of your Apple feed. Thank you for your continued support, and keep looking up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the first and most important thing that you must do if you're looking at a document, be able to establish the chain of custody. And again, you actually see that at the Center for UFO, or rather the Computer UFO organization website there, CUFON. Again, it's trying to keep up with all these acronyms. CUFON is not, as I understand, an active organization any longer, but the website remains online. It was one of the early online efforts to try and get documents online. And so again, you've got MUFON, they've got CUFON. Easily mixed up with the Center for UFO Studies. So anyway, CUFON, which is the Computer UFO Network, they actually state in their page about the Pentacle Memorandum, which I'm sure is oft visited because it is one of the only links online where the actual document can be read in its entirety. They state that this came to light through, I don't know that they ever really state exactly who released it, but in the dialogue that they include in exchanges between Barry Greenwood and Jacques Vallée, Valet says, we hope at some point that will come to light. He says, I have a suspicion about who might have released these documents. So at the time that this was posted, Valet didn't even know exactly how it had come to light. But it was later confirmed, as I understand it, and I think it had actually been Barry Greenwood who probably was able to obtain a copy of the memo through official channels. That would be through, filing a FOIA request. And that's one way that you would do this. Again, if someone says, here's a document and this is what it claims, make sure that you can establish the provenance of that document, even if that means, and you'll often find this, when I file a Freedom of Information Act request, often what I'll do is I will go first before I file anything, and I will, of course, you want to go to the respective government agency, go to their online reading room. The FBI has one called the Vault. The CIA also has a document reading room where you can go online and you can see documents that have been posted online that already have been released. And often they will link to popular documents or documents that are frequently requested. Make sure that what you're looking for hasn't already been posted online. That could save you some time and trouble. But something else that you might also look for is FOIA logs. If you can get access to the FOIA logs for a year or for several years, you can find out what kinds of things other people have been asking for. And honestly, sometimes reading through the FOIA logs can be as entertaining as reading documents themselves, because you see all the crazy crackpot stuff that people go and ask for. But if you can't find the FOIA logs online, then one thing you can do is you can FOIA the FOIA logs. You can file a Freedom of Information Act request for the actual FOIA logs, and then you can access information about what has already been asked for. then something, and I've seen journalists do this, when you read the FOIA logs, journalists will actually say, I'm respectfully requesting all documents filed by said individual. And so if someone has come forward and said that they've gotten a document, a journalist or a journalistic organization can go and FOIA what they requested. And then hopefully the same documents, if they were supplied to one individual, will be supplied to another. And a lot of, websites, blogs, news sources, outlets, one, for example, that a friend of mine, Brett Tingley, writes for is The War Zone, headed by Ty Rogaway. Those guys won't publish anything, even if the documents already exist, unless they can independently verify the documents through their own establishment of that chain of custody. So to the question, one of the best ways you can, assure yourself of the veracity of the documents, if it's posted online, I don't care if it's already been reported. I mean, there was an instance like this earlier this year where Yahoo News reported on something in a leaked FBI memo. When it appeared online, what did I do? I was curious. I went to the FBI. I FOIA'd the document that was already available online. And that is certainly one of the best ways, in my opinion, that you can establish that chain of custody. Certainly, really probably the most accurate way, too. And that's definitely going to help you assure yourself of the fact that the document in question, that you have at least what portions are reasonably exempt and non-redacted, actually are available to the public and where they came from.
Absolutely. And like you mentioned as well, our good friend and colleague, John Greenwald, you can go to his website as well, theblackvault.com, and just go to the search engine right on the website. And if you have something you're interested in, type it in, see what comes up. I mean, we're talking millions and millions of pages of declassified documents. So, I would have to agree.
He's just a monster. And again, actually, just let me add, too, that in addition to the reading rooms at the respective websites, don't forget to go and check the Black Vault, too, because John may already have asked for those documents. Again, insider knowledge. A lot of people aren't aware of this, even though it's well known. But the Bigfoot file that the FBI released a few years ago, where Peter Byrne, who I interviewed, had actually sent a hair sample to the FBI, and their forensic laboratory analyzed this for him. I think it came back, it was deer, not surprising. But John Greenwald got those documents before the FBI, subsequently after their release, posted them on their reading room. And then when journalists saw them at the reading room, it was big news. But John had posted the files like a year earlier because he was the one that requested and got them.
Boom. There you go. That's John knowing stuff before the FBI. I love it. Yep. All right. Well, Daniel on Facebook asks, Micah, do you think this has been the same secret study all along, or are different agencies doing their own secret studies at different times? Also, do you think between Blue Book and ATIP that Battelle was still doing their studies, them specifically, or do you think there are projects going on constantly when it comes to UFOs and the government's study of these, not known to the public?
That's, it's a bit of a complex question. I would say is that we have to define what we mean by a study. For instance, while Blue Book was underway, there were two UFO investigative studies, I guess you might call them that, or you might call them research efforts or projects that were initiated during the Vietnam period. And these actually overseas in the midst of the conflict. These, I think, occurred in the summer of 1968, I believe, or maybe 67. And they were called Have Fear and Lethal Chaser. These were very, very sophisticated instrumental arrays that were instituted on the ground in order to try and analyze unidentified aircraft that were being observed by U.S. troops over there in the demilitarized zone, during the Vietnam conflict. And I learned about these documents. They were released as a result of, military, I guess they were called lessons learned, and people who have filed a lot of, FOIA requests for documents with relation to military history are probably familiar with lessons learned reports. These were obtained, I believe, by Paul Dean first. Paul Dean, of course, brought them to my attention. And he has a couple of blogs on his fantastic website, UFOs Documenting the Evidence. It's his blog. Mr. Dean has done a great job reporting on that, and he and I've talked pretty extensively about it, too, on the phone, and also he came on my show at one point and talked about it. But, Paul and I keep in touch. But, again, these were very limited in scope, but basically the story was that people first were seeing these objects, egg-shaped objects, not unlike the Tic Tac from the famous 2004 Nimitz incident, And seeing these over the demilitarized zone, people were saying, are these Viet Cong aircraft or something? What are we observing here? It was quickly determined that these were not the enemies, and they certainly were not ours. And so we were trying to identify what they were. And so, telescopes, lasers, radio, radar, a lot of different kinds of instrumentation, as well as mobile units, which were essentially mounted on backpacks and used by American servicemen there on the ground, were instituted throughout the summer of that year to try and identify what these objects were. They made no sound. They moved very quickly. They sometimes produced a bluish glow. We never determined what they were. Big surprise, huh? But based on the descriptions of UFO sightings from during the Vietnam conflict, I mean, it sounds very much like Tic-Tac type aircraft were being observed during that conflict. And that's very interesting to me. But again, to the point, this was a limited study which occurred during the Blue Book years, but which did not have specific relevance to Blue Book, again, emanating from within the U.S. Army and not within the U.S. Air Force. But prior to the closure of Project Blue Book, I suspect that there have probably been a lot of very limited studies like that, which, in terms of maintaining operational security during a conflict like Vietnam or something, probably were seen as necessary at the time or would have been beneficial had they been successful. But again, they merely observed things that they couldn't identify, and so there was extremely limited success. And then there's a lessons learned report written, and then it gets filed away until somebody like Paul Dean finds it via FOIA. So again, there probably have been a lot of ongoing studies over the years. I don't know that we could say that, again, what the Battelle Institute was studying began and continued throughout the years and has continued, and that we're seeing that continuation even right up with ATIP, ALSAP, and what have you. I don't think that's the case. We, in fact, know that the Battelle Memorial Institute concluded their scientific review of Blue Book reports the year after the Robertson panel convened, and then that actually was published. But let's not forget what Project Blue Book Special Report number 14 actually said. I mean, it said that, like a lot of these UFO studies from over the years, a lot of these reports can be explained, but there are still a lot we can't put a finger on. We can't conclude what this actually is. There seems to be something worthy of study, and we can't identify it. And I'll note, this is significant, the University of Colorado project under Edward U. Condon came to the same conclusion. There were a lot of reports and sightings and investigations from the Blue Book years that they studied and that they reviewed. And on further inquiry, they could not come to any conclusions. The RAF Bentwaters incident, not the one from, again, Suffolk in 1980, but we're talking about the one from the 1950s, which was a radar visual case, well known, and it was also cited in the Blue Book files. They couldn't come to any conclusions about that one. And although Condon had said, we can't see any benefit to further scientific study right now of the UFO issue, we don't say that this should never be studied or that the book should be completely closed. Maybe on down the road, we should, reopen studies into UFOs. That's what Condon really said.
Interesting, because, I mean, all we hear of Condon is, I don't think there's anything to this UFO thing, but I'm not supposed to make that conclusion for another year or so. So you do have to wonder, maybe he was an advocate more than he would let on, but
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I do think he was dismissive of the UFOs, and I think he was biased when he went into it. And I think his conclusion was his conclusion. But again, I think he also was fair enough to say, look, this is what I think. We don't see anything worth studying, but, we're not saying it should never be studied. We're just saying you're going to be wasting your time right now. But again, should the same hold true today with technology like the Raytheon Zapfleer targeting pod? Obviously, we have some better instruments at our disposal today, don't we?
Absolutely, man. Absolutely. And I think the other thing we have to keep in mind is when it comes to these studies or these programs, as we learned with ATIP and OSAP, these things can be masked in many different ways. I mean, they're called things that we would never expect. The word UFO or UAP isn't used in the programs or the studies. It's AVs, aerial vehicles, or it's insert acronym here for what could actually be an unidentified aerial phenomena study, but we would never even know where to begin looking for it. So I think you're right. I think there's so many tentacles to the pentacle and everything in between. But let's move on to Matthew here on Twitter. He asks, Micah, has anyone ever considered a UFO flap that wouldn't fit what was proposed by the Pentacle Memo. There's been rumors about Hopkinsville, for example. Is it possible that the Benowitz affair might have been an extension of what the memo proposed, kind of these simulated or planned events? The Benowitz, I never would have even ventured to go into that territory with something planned. But yeah, what do you think? Could any of these things we've heard about, Hopkinsville, Rendlesham, this, that, have to do with what the Battelle Institute proposed as simulated events?
That's an interesting question. With Hopkinsville, if they decided to institute a simulated event, the description of the events that occurred there with the Hopkinsville, again, we're talking about presumably the Hopkinsville-Kelly incident. I would put that one more in the high strangeness camp, but it nonetheless, because of the fact that it involved at least tangent observations of UAP around the time of the famous goblins, that were seen there purportedly around the farm. It was interesting enough that it did warrant the attention of Blue Book, and there was an investigation, and it was included in the Blue Book files. You got to keep in mind, though, also that Heinik especially was interested in trying to log different stages of UFO encounters from, the daylight discs and the radar visuals all the way up through the CEs 1, 2, and 3. Close encounter, by the way. So the Hopkinsville-Kelly incident might have been a qualifier for, one of those close encounter type cases. To me, it's almost too strange to even really call it a UFO incident, although it certainly warrants some attention. But if we were to try and ask, could this be the kind of thing that was being discussed by Howard Cross, he seems pretty explicitly to be describing the institution of, and again, just to quote him, he talks about, where is the quote? I thought I had it right here in front of me, but I guess I could pull it up again. It's worth quoting him twice here. He says that there should be many types of aerial activity secretly and purposefully scheduled within the area. Well, the Hopkinsville goblins, if that's what we're talking about, wouldn't probably constitute aerial activity. But it's not outside the realm of the possible that, one might interpret that as being a controlled affair, that might have been some kind of an experiment. I think Nick Redfern has probably proposed that over the years. I know he said the same of the famous Flatwoods monster and suggested that might actually have been some kind of a sort of a weaponized system. In fact, he found a description of something very similar in a Rand Corporation file, which he wrote about a number of years ago. So, there's always that interpretation, but the problem with that interpretation of some classic UFO sightings from over the years is, to me, that, again, it is supposing that there is a conspiratorial government-based explanation for some of these high strangeness encounters, which, again, is as speculative as saying that it might have been exactly what people claim that they saw. And at the end of the day, we don't have any kind of clear resolution. It's a different story, again, if we FOIA, about that, and the government releases documents and says, what? Yeah, we had a bunch of, trained hedgehogs in silver suits that we put out there and everything and scared a bunch of, farmers in Hopkinsville. If there's a clear resolution, that's one thing. But again, everything else is just speculation. But again, I would not tie cases like that necessarily to what the Battelle Institute was doing, nor would I say that those are a continuation and that we're seeing essentially the same thing right on up to the modern era with ATIP and some of the programs we hear about today.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. This is a good question from Deb. Now, we've talked a lot about, U.S. funded programs and everything, especially Pentacle being one of them, but globally, Micah, Deb asks, is there any agency that collates global data on UFO reports? So much info seems to come from the U.S., although this is a global phenomenon. So have there ever been any programs or studies that you can think of that have been done globally? To me, this is such a issue with national security when it comes to the government studying these things. So that's why I tend to only find things country to country. But yeah, what do you think? Has there ever been a global study of the UFO phenomenon? Nothing's coming to my knowledge.
I don't think that there's been a comprehensive global effort on part of governments. There has been, of course, there have been instances where, for instance, Lee Spiegel led the charge to get Valet and a few others to actually brief the United Nations. That would be the closest thing, but it did not. I guess we would say it didn't result in a UN resolution or anything saying, okay, well, now we're going to institute a global UAP task force. Now, Wouldn't it be interesting if the result of the actual institution of the UAP task force under the U.S. Navy that Norquist is overseeing right now, that would be interesting if the result of a report like that was a global analysis, a UN-sponsored investigative organization that is, a unilateral observation of UFO information and recording of data forthcoming, in the future on a global scale as a result of the cooperation of different world governments. I mean, that would be fantastic, but I don't think we'll probably see that. And one of the reasons why is because if there's one thing we can take away from UFOs and what current studies from over the years seem to show us, it is that there's something that is, with regard to UAP, that involves very necessary secrecy. I mean, the Pentagon did disclose, well, they re-released 3 well-known videos earlier this year. In April, they officially disclosed the 3 videos that, again, appeared back in 2017, which I guess we have now learned that Chris Mellon essentially had kind of spearheaded that. And in fact, this is discussed, I believe, in James Fox's documentary, that, Chris had really led the charge with getting those videos released to the public, which my understanding was that they had not been classified at that point. They just weren't public. And one of them had already been online for a number of years, but without that provenance. That provenance didn't exist. And so therefore, there had still been some questions. When the videos were released through unauthorized channels, according to the government, the videos that were released were the full version of the videos. There weren't longer versions. And no, they hadn't been doctored or anything like that. I mean, the videos as they were released in that format were acknowledged by the Department of Defense as having been authentic videos from they were obtained by the Navy, but again, released via the DOD. And again, their conclusion after further review, and again, that review, Ryan, was aimed at making sure that there was no classified U.S. technology represented by the subjects of the film, nor was the technology used to obtain the information about the subjects indicative of any kind of secret U.S. technology that should not be made public to the general American or world public for that matter. Again, after that review process, they determined that nothing in the videos could not be released and that the subject of the videos, the purported phenomena, remained, they classed it as unidentified. So, I mean, that to me, and I think that, John Greenwald, Tim McMillan, MJ Banias, a lot of my colleagues in this field, Brett Tingley, yourself, we would all interpret that to mean, well, okay, so the government just released videos of something that they say they don't identify or can't identify. We can still, I guess, play a little word salad here and interpret what exactly that means. But again, taken at face value, it seems to indicate that they have established that chain of custody. These videos came from us. We don't know what the objects are. So yet again, we've got that verification through that chain of custody being established. That says a lot.
It really does. It does, man. Again, I was very surprised in their official release where it did state, these are genuine unidentified phenomena. And that's huge for our U.S. government to acknowledge that finally after how many years of denying that UFOs even were an issue or a thing. It's a big step. It really is. And now can I clarify something?
Please.
You guys said that the videos we saw, that this is all they had lengthwise. Now, I've heard from several individuals that the videos might actually be longer. Is this just conjecture, or has it officially been stated that the videos the public see, these 3 Navy UFO videos, that is the entire length of the incident as recorded by these Navy cameras?
That is what the DOD said. That is what they say. But like yourself, I have spoken to, for instance, I have spoken to Petty Officer Gary Voorhees, also Petty Officer Ryan Weigelt. I've communicated with Kevin Day. A lot of my colleagues have spoken to others, including Commander David Fravor and some of the other individuals, such as the weapons officers, who had actually been flying with him at the time of the 2004 Nimitz incident. Some of the folks I have spoken to, and I don't think Gary would mind me mentioning him by name because, again, he went on the record and told me this over the telephone for a podcast interview I did with him and Ryan Weigelt, that, yes, they had been watching what he described to me did not sound like the Raytheon at FLIR because, again, as far as I understand, the Raytheon at FLIR forward targeting pod, which was used to obtain the footage, and keep in mind that what was described by Dave Fravor, That's not what we see in the footage. The footage was obtained thereafter by another pilot. Again, that was you know his name.
Underwood.
Yeah, Chad Underwood. Thank you very much. Chad Underwood, he came forward and did the interview with New York Magazine. He was the pilot. Oh, and also, I'm sorry, Underwood also did a fantastic interview with Jeremy Corbell, which is available on YouTube, where he speaks at length about that experience. And so, again, for those who have said we weren't sure what Underwood filmed, it could be a 747 in the distance. I find that to be a highly dubious argument that Chad Underwood, operating this sophisticated technology, was unable to determine that this might just be a commercial aircraft in the distance. And further, for those who say that it could just be a drug runner flying without a transponder, if indeed what it was a mere commercial aircraft off in the distance, there absolutely would have to have been, if it were a commercial aircraft, a transponder operative. Not only did this aircraft that Underwood filmed, not only did it not operate with a transponder, not only was he not a great distance away. I don't think he was any more than about 19 miles at most away from this object. But the minute he begins to attempt to try and lock in on it with the targeting pod, it attempts to jam his radar, and he's having a hard time actually getting a lock on it. And then, of course, as has famously been pointed out at the end, when the thing just kind of zips out of the frame, it's not moving slowly. I mean, you got to keep in mind, he's tracking an object that's moving at tremendous speed at that point, and this thing is going like probably Mach 8, 9, 10, who knows what, when it's zipping out of the frame. And as Underwood stated, I didn't attempt to try and continue to film it. I'd already gotten the footage of the object. I did what I was told to do. He said, I didn't think much about it thereafter. He says, I'll let the scientists and the geeks, determine what that thing is. I was just told to go out there and film it, and I did. So that said, again, we have a lot of different data to unpack here. We have the testimony of Commander Fravor. We have the footage that Underwood obtained. We have the testimony of the radar operators aboard the Princeton, Gary Voorhees and Kevin Day. And talking with Kevin Day, he said, Gary Voorhees. Gary Voorhees said to me that, yes, there was footage, what appeared to be a live relay during the intercept attempt by Fravor and others, where they attempt, and again, he said that this would have been, I guess, I don't want to misspeak here, I guess that this would be equivalent to the gun cam. This was not, of course, the Raytheon AT-FLIR targeting pod. That, to me, to my understanding, there isn't a live relay feeding that footage back to the ship. But there is a live relay, a video system used on board those jets, which I think it would be, I believe it would be correct to call that the gun camera, but that should not be mistaken for what we see in the footage that Underwood obtained. That's not gun camera. I've heard some very good UFO researchers call that gun camera footage. It's not. That is not what that is. But Voorhees indicated to me that, and what's that system called? The something link. And I looked it up. In fact, you can read about it online. He told me I'll have to double check. It's unclassified, but I mean, there is a system that they use for live visualization like that. So Gary's recollection was that there was a live relay and that he and others were able to watch that at the time of the intercept attempt by Fravor et al. Okay. And that was when he saw the dynamics and the performance of this object. That's what Gary remembered. Mm-hmm. Petty Officer Weigelt also said that he recalled there being something on the screen, but he said he was dealing with a mechanical issue at the time and he wasn't paying attention to what everybody was watching. But he said he remembered something being on the screen. But that would not have been the same thing as the footage that Chad Underwood obtained. And therefore, when the DOD said this is the complete footage, I'm sure that does, well, at least I think it's a reasonable proposition that they aren't saying, they aren't lying when they say that there wasn't more footage in their possession. But what I think that the petty officers aboard the Princeton and others who said that they saw footage were describing was not the same thing as the footage obtained by Chad Underwood.
Interesting. Hey, that demystifies a lot because I know there's been a lot of talk of we're only seeing a portion of the video. Well, yeah, that very well could be the case. That's the only video that the DOD has in their possession. So I guess they're not lying. They're good. They're good, like I said, of tiptoeing and with wording and everything in between. So we cannot fault them for that. Yeah.
But because of that, Ryan, I strongly suspect there are other both video and photo, representations of these UAP. I don't doubt that there are probably others. That's not some sort of an inside tip or anything. I'm merely saying that because of their efficacy at playing word salad, I don't doubt that there are other things in their possession which the public does not know about and which may not even be classified. And if we wanted to try and gain access to those things or file FOIA requests, you're not going to get access to something that you don't even know how to begin to know what to ask for.
Yeah.
And it could be years if we ever see these things, right?
It could be years, it could be days, it could be weeks. No one can really say, but that's the UFO anticipation world we live in, Micah. Well, let's end these listener questions with a Bigfoot question. I'm talking to a host of a Bigfoot podcast. So the Bigfoot Society podcast collectively asks Micah, do you ever find your love for UFOs and your love for Bigfoot intersecting? And if yes, how so?
Well, the closest I would say that they come to intersecting is that I try to apply a scientifically informed historical approach to both topics. But I understand the question that they're asking there. I do not find continuity between those avenues of research. For instance, Sasquatch to me, I treat as a flesh and blood animal, and one that is more like humans than any other known species, if it exists. And I have some reservations. But nonetheless, to quote the archaeologist Myra Shackley, even if we acknowledge, and I do, the folkloric aspects and the continuity between cultural traditions about purported wild people and things like that throughout time, there's obviously a heavily steeped element that deals exclusively in folklore, but myths and folklore do not leave footprints in the ground. That was Shackley's contention and how she ended her wonderful book from the 1980s, Still Living, Sasquatch, Yeti, and the Neanderthal Enigma, and or I should say Neanderthal. But, again, I share Shackley's contention that there is enough data that supports, however little there's enough, I think, that supports the treatment of that subject as a physical reality. And there are many people who are like, but yeah, lights show up in the same places where Sasquatches are seen. Okay, great. You might also say that ice cream cones are sold in many of the same cities above which UFO sightings occur. But I wouldn't correlate ice cream cones with UFO sightings. And again, we have to remember this is a fundamental scientific tenet that correlation does not necessarily mean causation. And just because two phenomena might occur in a similar area, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a correlation. So I draw no connections between the Sasquatch subject, which, again, I always try to treat and proceed with studying as a scientifically informed historical researcher. Do the same thing with UFOs, but I treat that in an entirely separate way. Same goes with my archaeology stuff I do. Has no relationship to UFOs or Sasquatch. A lot of researchers, I think they want there to be some grand unifying theory of the paranormal. I don't know that there is one any more than there's a grand unifying theory in physics. And the late Stephen Hawking said, we may have to settle for there simply being many partial theories that explain the variety of things that we observe in the universe. He said we may have to settle for that. And if we do, you know what? I'm okay with it. It just gives us more stuff to have to study.
Absolutely. The theory of everything. I couldn't agree more with you, man. And hey, I think the historical approach that you've taken to many of these topics is a lot more important than I think people give it credit for. I mean, last time I had you on, we were talking about UFO cases from the 15th, 16th century. And I mean, the historical context in which you put some of these events, you were almost able to explain some of these events due to simply knowing the history behind what was going on in the area and the culture at the time. So the fact that you, the Time Lord, are possibly solving UFO cases from the 16th century tells me something that you're on the right track. So I couldn't agree more with you of looking at these topics, not as a sort of phenomenal string theory, but from a historical standpoint. So I have to respect you for doing that.
The same applies to the Pentacle Memorandum. Again, if you want the answers, you have to understand what's happening at that time. What was going on in government, what was going on, what was Heinek doing and what was Valet doing, what were their perspectives, what were they being told, what were they not being told. Again, I really think it's important. And, Tim McMillan and I were talking about this the other day with our good friend MJ Banias, that with UFOs, even though there's no overt threat to this, there doesn't appear to be anything threatening about this phenomenon. But any what appears to be significantly technologically advanced phenomena in our midst that we can't account for, it must be treated as a potential national security concern. If you don't want to say threat, although again, ATIP, right, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, that's exactly what they're doing. We assess the potential threat because if it seems to be able to outfox us and we don't know whose it is, we have to always proceed with caution and that potential on the table. But if we want to actually get to the bottom of what this phenomena is, again, we must be historically and scientifically inclined. Those two things, I think, are going to take us, that's going to help us make leaps and bounds toward resolving this issue. And who knows, once we, or if we are able to at some point, it might make us as humankind all the better for it. We could hope so, at least.
We can always hope. I keep that hope, man. We need it now more than ever. The number one word we can leave with everything going on in the world right now is hope, for change, for new discoveries and revelations. And I think that's what you do best. And all the other people out there watching and listening, think for yourself, do your own research like Micah has done tonight on the Pentacle Memorandum, and keep looking up. So, brother, as always, I got to thank you for coming on Somewhere in the Skies today.
Yeah, next time I owe you one. You got to come on my show too, okay? So thank you for everything you do. Every week I hear from people, did you hear Ryan's show about this or Ryan's show about that? I do a show about UFO hackers, and this kid, he emails me and says, did you see the show I did about this, with a whole different angle on it? Again, so the more we're able to do together, in my opinion, the better. And I always appreciate it and enjoy the time, brother.
My absolute pleasure.
Somewhere in the Skies is part of the Somewhere podcast universe. Please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. To learn more about all of our shows, visit thespu.com.